Welcome to my GameDev Joyride and the first episode of Master Devlog. I started this channel to document progress of the project, share my experiences and workflow in case someone wants to start a project of their own, and to gather feedback on the game, so if you have any suggestions or ideas, please leave them in the comments below. In this first episode I will focus on how I imagine procedural generation of levels. I think replayability will be essential to all other mechanics I'd like to implement, and I'd like to hear your opinions on what you think would work best for this type of game. My adventure with game development started in early 2020 when I took a GameDev.tv course in Unity 3D. I was surprised how much I enjoyed it, and I realized this could be actually something more than a hobby. I spent hundreds of hours digging through YouTube tutorials and eventually decided that I wanted to make a third-person action game which would have some hand-to-hand combat, blade weapons and shooting. The first version of the game was a true joyride. I experimented with controller and used visual scripting for animation and combat setup. I remember the first mechanic in the long feature creep list that followed. I wanted to have destructible environment that would allow player to use certain parts of the levels as weapons or tools. I never forget the feeling I had when I managed to set up the first kick animation and make that pipe thing usable for fighting. Instantly, in my head, images appeared of the old games I played as a kid and all the fun things you could do to the bad guys. That was really powerful image, and it enforced the feeling that in a game engine you could do everything providing you have time, skills and passion for your project. That was the moment I knew I would stick with the hand-to-hand combat and shooter combination. I wanted to make an action-packed game that bring back to life some of that old feeling from my childhood. I tried to make adaptive jumping that would check the height of the obstacle and adjust the jump height. I tried doing some jump force accumulation to charge up the jump height. I learned a lot, but I tended to focus on fighting and neglected the importance of writing proper controller. As a result, as my friend told me, I had a frog character that would limp instead of running and glide instead of walking. But when I saw how much you could do with the designing behavior of enemies, I pressed on, pushing the details like physics and movement aside. I experimented with basic enemy combat, learned how to apply damage, hit reactions on different body parts, and how to set up more powerful weapons and switch between blade and ranged combat, still jumping like a frog. Then I've set up some objects as explosives and managed to make them explode only when shot at with specific weapon type, and it was really satisfying. Energy weapons, on the other hand, proved to be more difficult as I couldn't set up properly the beam with the enemy distance, but for the time being this didn't bother me that much. I had too much fun shooting beams at robots with my plasma rifle. To sum up, it was all really satisfying, but it posed one serious problem. The ideas were piling up and I still didn't have a proper movement controller. Setting up new attacks without reliable controls was pointless, regardless of how Jedi-like they felt, and I knew at that time writing one would take ages. So I decided to use a game-ready solution, and I chose Invector controller. It took me some time to decipher the controller, but it only accelerated the feature creep. Now I knew the possibilities were endless, and I had to seriously think of what kind of game I would like to create. Thankfully, the GDC came with help and made me realize I had to re-evaluate my skills. So at that time I knew I love coding for games, but I'm far from being a master coder. I'm terrible at art. On the other hand, I have endless pool of ideas. I tend to have holistic view on most things, so I should be able to handle a large scope. I've had my fair share of experience in storytelling, which is essential to any decent game. And when I say I have some experience, I mean quite a lot of pages of experience. So I started intensive paper prototyping, and I was able to extract the 3 pillars that would support players' experience. 1. Immersive, satisfying gameplay with focus on blade and shooter combat. 2. Replayability with procedural levels and adaptive environment. 3. Players' meta experience, which would rely on multiple story layers and dynamic relation between player and the character. The story is simple. There's a maze, a modular space station maze if you like, which is owned, built and controlled by an interstellar corporation. The maze is designed and maintained as a reality show e-sport arena. Maze runners are either professionals or unlucky citizens of human colonies, and they can participate only as puppets, surrogates, controlled by wealthy and augmented elite of humanity, called the Eternals. Player begins as one of the Eternals, selects their champion, connect with them via Neuralink, and move them into the maze. Each run starts in the seed room, which is a kind of lobby where maze runners can get back to after a successful run or after being reconstructed, if that's possible. Players can choose one of available paths to follow and explore them until they reach a given goal. In order to progress within the maze, player must open doors leading to new sections of the maze. Opening a door may require a key, which can be obtained as a loot or an award for completing a mission. The main victory conditions may vary on players' decisions and may be getting to the maze core, defeating the maze master and gaining its role, gaining prestige as Eternal, helping maze runner to survive, releasing the maze runner if they ask for help, or many others depending on how deep the player will get with the storyline. In order to complete one of these goals, the player will need to learn game mechanics, figure out synergies, character perks, master blade or ranged combat, find shortcuts and inevitably make a fair number of maze runs. And this brings us to the main theme of this episode, which is how to make replayability an advantage. Level design can make miracles, but in the end, some sort of randomness or procedurally generated areas are a must. I haven't given too much thought to this at the beginning, but the more I experimented with the idea, the more I knew choosing only one of those paths was not an option. If I chose order and procedurally populated areas, they could be perceived as dull after a few game sessions. On the other hand, using chaos of randomness could look fake and make hard to control. In the beginning I thought that procedural approach is always better. Even if it takes more effort, it's worth the time spent because it's more reliable. However, with each new idea I realized that's not always the case, and you may get really interesting results relying on randomness. So which one is better? If you have thought on this, please drop a comment. Let's start with generating the maze itself. The prototype you can see consists of 7 corridors, modules, and 3 room sizes plus 3 higher variants. The way I tried doing it at first was to predict path of a corridor and check which corridor prefab or room variant could be spawned at the end. It was doable, but it produced more bugs than a pile of rotten meat in full sunshine. After spending too much time on this issue, I decided to bet on random corridors, with one simple rule: they have to follow more or less straight path in a given direction. This way I could easily check which directions are available for corridors spawning at a given y-axis level. Additional advantage of that approach was that I could set up as many different corridor variants which could be tested easily in a given combination within one pathway direction. So at that point I would give randomness 1 point, procedural 0. Happy with the result, I decided to follow whispers of the random. I used 3 empty objects for each spawnable item, creating this way an XYZ area in which anything could be spawned. This worked pretty well, so I used that setup for spawning doors and platforms as well. The most troublesome was applying broom rotation through the areas, but eventually it all worked like a charm. So in this first exercise, I've set up 4 platforms, left, right, front and middle, which would break into smaller ones if needed and would be spawned randomly within their spawning areas. Using some variables, I managed to shift them up or down, rotate to a specific angle, and even set spawning some items at the highest ones. This allowed me to come up with more or less accessible layouts, which rarely look identical. Applying a dissolve shader on top of that created some new potential, as player now could be encouraged to learn how to traverse platforms that appear and disappear dynamically, adapting to the character's movement. So in this case, I give 1 point to procedural and 1 point to random. Then, using the same method, I started to set up some random objects player and enemies could use for cover, climbing or even pushing. I've applied climbing on platforms and it all started to make sense. Placing blocks on platform was relatively easy, but fixing Invector's rotation problem with pushable objects that player could climb on was quite challenging. I managed to do this by adding several triggers and colliders, so it's definitely doable, and I think this could add extra variety to the gameplay, especially when it can be used for triggering some devices, uncovering paths, loot, or even acting as explosives or crushing enemies below. So at this point, 1.4 procedural. Then, just like with everything in life, the best happened by accident. In an attempt to avoid rigid body blocks overlapping, I used physics engine to separate them, and I realized that they could stay in the air. After multiple attempts, I was able to set up a system where, using randomness of physics engine, I could generate platforms in the air that would look nothing like the ones that were spawned along the walls. Since rigid bodies got involved and everything is generated in real time, it is still a challenge to tweak this enough so that it doesn't affect the performance. Also, having all those climbing triggers and animations in place, it took me some time to fix ground checking, but I think it was worth the effort. Using Odin Inspector, I was able to set up rules for each object's behavior or control them from the room control level, and to shape them either into loosely spawned clusters or bulky structures that could be accessed only, for example, if gravity was disabled or if a jetpack was found by player. Of course, the method doesn't have to be limited only to platforms. We could use it for any environment element spawning. The structures could be used for spawning rare items, avoiding enemies, or setting up ambush. So in this case, I will give 2 strong points to randomness and 1 to procedural. Then I decided to use the available space between doors. It could be used for extra doors, hidden rooms, pushable plates, windows, or other interactive objects. This was purely procedural with a pinch of randomness. I decided to set up 5 arrays of objects. Each array could hold a reasonable number of prefabs spawned randomly with or without a count limit. Objects spawned this way could be spread along the wall, on its surface, or moved by an offset toward center of the room. This gave me another tool to change the room's corridors or any other areas I come up with using custom lights, plates, decorations, doors, turrets, traps, drone nests, whatever I come up with, you name it. Setting up count, spacing and various offsets, we can get pretty interesting results. When I think of it, the only trouble now is the art part and how to make full use of this feature. Thankfully, we're in a sci-fi world where anything is possible, and hopefully even someone like me, whose autistic development slowed to halt in around 5th grade, can squeeze out some juice out of simple 3D objects. I have to mention one more thing that is crucial and which relies heavily on pure chance of appearing within a spawnable area. One of the key tricks I used is a combination of depth mask and collision layers. I use it for spawning ceiling, floor and wall windows, and since they can be moved freely, they have potential to randomly change shape of paths, which may add additional element of variety. And putting that all aside, I think this is really cool. Since this is a prototype project, I did some other testing, like below floor levels with sliders and elevators. A room maze with single, vertical, horizontal or cluster walls, moving depending on specific conditions. An X-ray, a shield, or even an adaptive advert template for displaying various information to the player. Having a clear vision of what I want the project to be, I had to try out every feature before I decided to fit it in the game and implement it. Following this workflow, I tested other stuff as well. I have initial enemy AI setup, including enemy profile and behavior patterns, destructible object setup using Greyfire, blade combat feature including separate weapon stances and attacks for different weapons, blade weapon mastery system focusing on speed, accuracy and damage dealt, and adaptive audio system, reading players' performance and adjusting it to the current gameplay state at a given moment. It sounds like a lot, but doing all that fun stuff is what pushes me and this project forward, and I hope it will keep you intrigued enough to wait for the next episode of Master Devlog. Also, if you find this interesting and would like me to include any specific feature in the next episode, please let me know. Hopefully, in Devlog 2, I will be able to share some new props and weapons I've been working on in Blender, as well as show the cover feature and how it works with the climb up and pushable blocks. That's all for now. Have a great day.